pleased to rise on behalf of the women and men serving in the Canadian Armed Forces in the Ottawa Valley, across Canada and abroad. In February, the Standing Committee on National Defence passed its 8th report. The report said, quote, given that the rent for the Canadian military personnel living on bases is increasing in April, and at a time when the military is struggling to recruit and retain personnel, the committee report to the House that the government immediately cancel all plans to increase rent on military accommodations used by the Department of National Defence, end quote. Unfortunately, for those living and serving in the CAF, this NDP Liberal government could not be bothered to read it. April 1st came and the rent went up. Along with the higher rents, our fighting forces also had to pay the higher Liberal carbon tax. The official policy of the Liberal Party is to make life unaffordable. While Canadians saw taxes on energy go up 23% across the country, the average rent for Canadians in uniform went up 4.2%. Now, if this socialist coalition had its way, CAF members in Ontario would have seen a 6.8% rent hike. It was only thanks to the Ford government in Toronto putting a cap on rent increases that at 2.5 that the NDP Liberal cash grab was prevented. The same thing happened in Nova Scotia. This radical extremist government wanted to rent hikes by 9.3%. Instead, the province capped rent hikes to 5%. CAF members in Newfoundland and Labrador were not lucky enough to have a Conservative premier. Their rent went up 8.3%. In Yellowknife, rent was up by $111 a month. In Iqaluit, it went up by $131 a month. A Bay Street lawyer renting a fancy penthouse in downtown Toronto paying $5,000 a month would have seen a smaller rent increase than a soldier stationed in Iqaluit. Under Chrétien and Martin, you got the feeling Liberals were largely indifferent to the Canadian Armed Forces. But this bunch treats them with disdain. These punishing rent hikes reveal the true ideology of the Socialist Coalition. They are intentionally underfunding the armed forces. They are driving serving members out of the military and discouraging new recruits from joining. They want to see the fighting force atrophy and eventually die so they can replace the military with a climate corps focused only on disaster response. Even the stuff the old Liberals used to prefer the military to focus on, such as so-called peacekeeping, is now outsourced to the communists who control China. The latest Liberal cuts to defense budget spending are putting our women and men at risk. Normally, before being stationed abroad, our armed forces undergo combined arms training. Every unit that had been sent to Latvia as part of Operation Reassurance had undergone combined arms training until now. Thanks to the latest round of Liberal austerity, combined arms training has been cut. Former Liberal Member of Parliament, retired General Andrew Leslie, told the CBC Today that cuts to military training were dangerous. Quote, I'm not aware of any other NATO army which will be deploying troops to the front line of a possible confrontation with Russia who are not 100% trained according to a variety of battle test standards, end quote. It's not just the army facing cuts. This far-left socialist prime minister is outsourcing fighter pilot training. Now the second largest country in the world can't even train its own fighter pilots. For anyone with a passing knowledge of Canadian history, the loss of pilot training under this socialist coalition is heartbreaking. Canada was home to the Commonwealth Air Training Program. Between 1939 and 1945, over 130,000 pilots and aircrew from around the world were trained here in Canada. Many of these pilots fell in love with Canada or a Canadian, then came back here after the war and helped build this great nation. Few Canadians even know we once had an aircraft carrier until it was scrapped by Pierre Trudeau. The anti-military apple doesn't fall far from the Marxist tree. Mr. Speaker, I almost wish this Prime Minister's military dismantling was a part of a hidden agenda, but it's not. It's a very, very public agenda, and young Canadians are paying attention. They see the news stories about higher rents for CAF members. They see the news stories about poor equipment and cuts to training. They see what this government is doing, and they want no part of it. Recruitment will continue to decline because the government and this Prime Minister have done everything they can to drive it down. Fewer serving members in the CAF means less money for the Defence Department and more money for buying votes from special interest groups. The recent budget reveals the government's real priorities. They plan to spend $0 on military housing this year, $0 next year, but 2 years from now, watch out, because they plan to spend a whopping $1 million on military housing. That's the same year these socialists have budgeted to spend over $500 billion on program expenses. Now, despite liberal inflation, $1 million still sounds like a lot. But in a $500 billion budget, it comes out to 0.0000002%. $1 million is not a rounding error, but that was about 3 zeros ago. $1 million for military housing 2 years from now is an insult. Compare that to the $400 million they plan to spend this year on housing students seeking asylum at Conestoga College. That is money the CAF could use today to make desperately needed repairs for military housing. As the Member of Parliament for the largest army base in Canada, I've seen firsthand the state of some of the housing. Asbestos, black mold, peeling paint, and leaky pipes are just some of the ongoing issues on base. They've never put that on recruiting posters. But as bad as some units are, many soldiers will happily take whatever they can because the cost to rent off base has exploded under this Prime Minister. It used to be that a serving soldier was earning enough to buy a house, but now they have to reach the rank of general to afford buying a home. Mr. Speaker, with yesterday's confession by the Minister of Defence, the truth is out. Quote, trying to go to Cabinet or even to Canadians and tell them that we had to do this because we need to meet this magical threshold of 2%. Don't get me wrong, it's important, but it was really hard to convince people that it was a worthy goal, that it was some noble standard we had to meet, end quote. Now, recent polls have shown that a majority of Canadians support much higher defence spending. Canadians would have needed no convincing had the Minister of Defence made the case to Canadians, but he never tried. His description of the NATO defence pledge as a magical threshold, a worthy goal, or a noble standard is revealing. It hardly sounds like someone who could make a persuasive case to a group of pacifists and socialists. Russia is waging a war on Ukraine. China is threatening to invade Taiwan. Iran is funding terror worldwide and launching drone attacks on Israel. Not since the Korean War has the case for increasing defense spending been more obvious. Yet despite the state of the world, this NDP Liberal government is cutting defense spending. But Mr. Speaker, this isn't the first time the Liberals have led the CAF into a decade of darkness, yet this time it's different. Even under the Chrétien Liberals' cuts in the 90s, Canadians were still eager to join up. Those days are gone. That's because an entire generation of Canadians have spent the last 9 years hearing a Prime Minister downplay our once proud country. Why would any young person risk their lives for a post-nation state? Why sign up for a country its own Prime Minister would rather apologize for? When this socialist coalition looks at the country, all they see is a racist colonial oppressor full of neo-Nazis hiding behind every truck trailer. They've hired an army of ideological stormtroopers to lead re-education camps. They use every opportunity to erase symbols of our proud history. The truth is, this NDP Liberal government is ashamed of Canada. And why would anyone want to serve their country when the very people running it don't like it? It's not only that these socialists don't like Canada, but they don't think much of those of us who love Canada. They don't like the kind of people who are proud to wear the uniform, bearing our national flag. For this Prime Minister, they're all just a bunch of racists and misogynists and unacceptable fringe minority. The truth is, this radical far-left Marxists across the way who are the fringe minority of government. Under 9 years, Canadians are tired of a Prime Minister who constantly apologizes for our country's very existence. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost to our security.
All right. I just want to make sure the honourable member for